Okie dokie. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to talk to you tonight about marine invasive non-native species in Ireland. As mentioned previously, my name is John Kelly. I am the relatively new program manager with the National Biodiversity Data Centre, leading on our new area of work focused on invasive species, which will run
John, you haven't
between.
shared your screen yet,
Oh, it says I have. Oh,
but you haven't
oh,
shared it to me.
okay, let me try again.
Yep, working much better this time.
Great. Let's not share that publicly. Okie dokie. First of all, thank you very much, folks. My name is John Kelly. I am the program manager with the National Biodiversity Data Centre, leading on our invasive species work over the next number of years. Over my presentation, I'm going to give you an overview about our work in general. I will give you an introduction to invasive species. I will show you some priority species to look out for. That will range from ones that you are highly likely to encounter in Ireland to some that you're less likely to encounter. I'll talk about biosecurity measures, promoting that to everyone, as preventing these species spreading is incredibly important. And then I'll talk a little bit about recording species and the benefits that will bring. First of all, I want to mention our biodiversity maps facility that the National Biodiversity Data Centre runs. We are funded by the Heritage Council to host Ireland's National Biodiversity Data Set. We have a number of really important catalogues and data sets housed in that. It's all open access for the most part. It's free to download as well. You can see here from the current screenshot as of the 4th of April of this year, we have almost 7 million records covering 18,000 species. And in invasive species, we have almost 92,000 records. So it's a significant resource. We have All Ireland marine mollusks, citizen science data sets, ladybirds of Ireland, and a lot more. In our invasive species work, we have the work that we've been leading for the last 15 years on invasive species. We've set up a web portal called invasives.ie, which holds a lot of information about Ireland's response to invasive species. It holds a lot of information about where you can report invasive species, get alerts for new species that have arrived in Ireland, find information on how to prevent and manage species, and then generally just the policy and legal response to invasive species. So I would encourage you to have a look at that if you want to find out anything about what I talk about today, or in general, just invasive species in general. I want to highlight our new work program, which started this year. It's funded by the data centre, of course, the Heritage Council, the Department of Housing, the Shared Island Initiative, National Parks and Wildlife Service, and the Northern Ireland Environment Agency. We have 4 key work streams in that. Our Shared Island work, which covers Northern Ireland and Ireland, covers marine, freshwater, and terrestrial, focuses on biosecurity, preventing invasive species from arriving in the first place, and then slowing the rate of spread. We have our marine non-Indigenous species work, which is funded by the Department of Housing and Local Government. That will set up a new marine invasive species strategy for Ireland. We have our engagement work, which focuses on raising awareness of invasive species. You will have seen in my previous slide a screenshot that highlighted Invasive Species Awareness Week, and that is one of the key flagship events that our engagement officer, Kate Moore, is leading on. And then the core data center work that myself and my colleague Colette lead on a regular basis. I want to acknowledge our funders for the Shared Island Initiative. It is because of them that I'm here tonight to give you this presentation, and I'm very grateful for their funding and support. Now on to marine invasive species. First of all, I'm going to acknowledge that this is a field fraught with changing terminology and different terminology. I'm going to aim to be consistent and I will focus on either non-native species or invasive species. Non-native species are basically species that are outside of their natural range, and they're only here because of human intervention. They have not arrived because of natural range expansion. They have arrived on our shores or in Ireland because of human intervention. The ones that cause either economic or ecological harm or even societal harm are the ones we term invasive species. Not all non-native species become invasive, as you will see as my presentation goes on. In marine worlds, we also bring in the term non-indigenous species, which is another way of describing non-native species. In the European context, they frequently use the word alien, but in Ireland and the UK, I try to avoid that word because some people determine it as little green men coming to take over rather than a technical description. Invasive species are not just a local problem, they are a global problem. There has been a number of really important pieces of work looking at the impact of invasive species around the world. And I'll talk about some of them as my presentation goes on. But I want to highlight some species that may have come across in the news, specifically outside Ireland, looking at Caulerpa taxifolia, for example, a species of green algae. It's very famous for becoming, when it was first introduced into the Mediterranean, it was also introduced into the Indian and Pacific and Atlantic Oceans as well. The strain of concern is an aquarium strain that's cold resistant. And it was introduced by accident into the Mediterranean from a public aquarium in Monaco, where it is spread all around the Mediterranean. The problem with this aquarium strain is that it smothers other algae species, seagrasses, and invertebrate communities. It does this by outcompeting species for food and light or due to the toxic effects of compounds that are contained in its foliage. Fish species that eat this can accumulate those toxins, which when they eat, which make them unsuitable for human consumption. Another species that you may be aware of from away from our shores is the lionfish. This has become the poster child for marine invasive species issues, especially in the North Atlantic region. They are notorious invasive species. They're almost on par with the zebra mussel in the freshwater environment. Thankfully, this species is not expected to survive in our waters, but they are a lesson of why we need to prevent species arriving in the first place. This particular species is impacting on coral reefs and marine ecosystems, particularly in the Caribbean. This includes commercially and recreationally important fish that many people depend on for their livelihoods. Some of you may have even seen this, the control efforts throwing up on social media. And from that, you get a real feel of the effort that divers have to go into to control an invasive species. Closer to home, because I'm going to go through a number of species, I'm only going to give you a list of some of the impacts here, but I'll give you a little bit more detail through the individual species accounts later on in my presentation. But invasive species are known to impact native habitats and seabeds habitats. A key example is the slipper limpet, which Ireland, we are at a relatively early stage in the invasion, so we haven't seen those impacts yet. But that species can smother native species. It can change ecosystems, particularly where there's muddy substrate. The invasive species can impact on seabirds, particularly at the colonies, nesting colonies on islands, as I mentioned earlier on. The invasive species can predate on native marine species, and we'll talk about non-native crabs later in my presentation. They can form dense incrustations covering boats and indeed marine habitats. This can be very expensive for vessels and controlling of fouling on vessels. They can impact on aquaculture, such as the carpet sea squirt or Didynum vexillum, which I'll mention again. Slipper limpet, again, which comes up as a risk to aquaculture. They can cause harmful or indeed nuisance algal blooms. Harmful algal blooms can impact um, on filter feeding organisms such as oysters or mussels. Nuisance algal could be blooms of green algae as well. And they can drive ecosystem change. This in our environment is usually a slow process of change. Invasive species are an economic impact as well. Back in 2013, through work funded by National Parks and Wildlife Service and the Northern Ireland Environment Agency, I estimated that the economic impact of invasive species is around 200 million euros to the Irish economy. Correcting that for inflation, it's about €250 million each and every year. In that analysis, we identified impacts across all of our main economic sectors, including agriculture, including tourism. Impacts were in the freshwater, marine, and terrestrial environments as well. Data indicates that the threats of invasive species are increasing. This is not just in Ireland, this is across the globe. It's for a whole host of species across taxa and across regions. Here you see data from the IPBES, the International Planet. I forget what IPBES means, so we'll leave that for now. But you see that the impact of invasive species is just going up over time, and it's been a sharp increase in recent years. A compounding effect will be the impact on climate change. We expect that invasive species will become harder to manage and more widespread as a result of climate change. In the terrestrial environment, I've seen firsthand how invasive species can lead to increased fire risks, where in Cape Town in South Africa, where a lot of the plants that were associated with that wildfire risk were indeed non-native and invasive species. So what is the evidence that the invasive species are increasing over time in Ireland? Well, if we look at the data over the last 3 decades, you can see that there's a key trend. Looking at the bar graph, the number of invasive species. Now, this focuses on invasive species that are not native to anywhere on the European continent. So this is just invasive species from further afield. But you can see that there is a clear trend of an increasing rate of introduction. And this will represent economic growth. It will represent that the island of Ireland is more connected to the outside world today compared to in previous decades. You can see that a lot of the species are algae, ascidians, bryozoans, crustaceans, mollusks. So you can see the trends in the data in the marine environment. Where are they coming from? Again, the evidence over the last 3 decades shows that the Pacific region in particular is a key area of concern. So these are not species just jumping from England or Wales, our closest neighbor. They are species coming much further afield. I want to say as well, and just acknowledge that at the National Biodiversity Data Centre, we are reviewing some of our data sets at this moment in time. One of the key ones that we're reviewing is the catalogue of Ireland's non-native species. And over the next few years, I hope to be able to bring you some updated trends on invasive species across all environments. We will also be able to look at the number of invasive species in Ireland and prioritise those into high high, medium, and lower impact species. I do want to highlight invasive species of union concern. At this moment in time, there's 88 invasive species of union concern, but I do know that the European Commission is currently considering updating that with a number of additional species. And again, those species cross marine, freshwater, and terrestrial environment. And those invasive species of union concern carry with them a particular legal responsibility. So it's important that we are clear on the ID of species when they're reported to the likes of Sea Search or indeed the data center. So how do invasive species get here? You will not be surprised to hear that there's been a really detailed analysis of how invasive species get around the world. The Convention on Biological Diversity, which is a global convention, has categorized how invasive species spread around the world. There are three main pathways. So intentional, where it's humans have decided that they want to either for economic reasons or for personal reasons that they want to move a species from one area to another. Aquaculture is a good example of an economic driver. Establishing a new fishery is a driver that might be more personal to an individual level. Yes, there are times when people are trying to establish their own fishery legally. There's also unintentional methods. So this is basically the likes of ballast water, which I'll talk about very, very soon. It's basically what contaminates a trade. And then obviously you have natural dispersal. We can't talk about invasive species without talking about ballast water. Ballast water is moving billions of tons of water and sediment around the world each and every year. This is bringing in water in one region, which may have organisms that are viable, and then holding them while they move across the world, and then discharging that ballast water at a destination port or destination site. And that over the last number of decades has become very, very important, and more people have been aware of that. Hull fouling is another critical pathway for introduction of invasive species. So here you see just how widespread the habitats on the hull of a ship are. So you see the areas that you could not access around a blade or propeller. You see the species and the habitat underneath the waterline as well. Some of you may be aware of sea chests and other niche areas on vessels, but a sea chest is essentially where the ship brings in the water. They normally have a grate to protect from large sediments, but that creates ample habitat, potential nesting sites, settlement sites for marine species. And that creates difficulties in managing and preventing species from arriving. Thankfully, there's been a lot of global effort in trying to manage those three areas. So one key global effort is the Ballast Water Management Convention, which came into force in 2017. The Department of Transport in Ireland are leading in the policy response for this here. And as part of their work, or part of our work, we're engaging with them. And we hope to support them in establishing monitoring for particular species at key ports around Ireland over the next few years. I'm pretty sure all of you will know that invasive species and non-native species are associated with aquaculture. But also, I'm pretty sure that we'll all agree that aquaculture is very important for economic activity in the context of Ireland. This is an area that's also received a lot of attention over the last decade. This attention is partly due for economic reasons and partly due for environmental reasons. But BIM have led a really expansive program to raise awareness of invasive species with the aquaculture sector. They've trained the sector in how to identify species. They've established reporting mechanisms, risk assessments for the industry, all to try to reduce the risk of invasive species arriving and indeed spreading from their sites. You can see from the map that because aquaculture is pretty much all around Ireland, this activity has been all around Ireland as well. So we are expecting to see a reduction in the rate of spread of invasive species because of the work that BIM and aquaculture industry are putting in. Next, I want to talk about recreational boating. This is something that you are all probably very familiar with as well, because obviously you're out on boats, you will be leaving from marinas and ports and harbours all around Ireland. But here you see Didymnum vexillum at one of the first sites reported from Malahide Marina in 2005. You will see that it's heavily encrusted on the hull of this yacht. Here you see all of the marinas around Ireland as well. So you can see that there's a lot of potential for invasive species to be spread around Ireland. It doesn't take a lot to go from Dublin all the way up to Carlingford or even round to Clew Bay and Mayo. But again, there's a lot of effort going underway to manage the risks associated with marine invasive species. You have the rapid assessment of marine non-native species in Irish marinas, which Katie O'Shaughnessy, who some of you might know, was involved with, funded by MPWS. And then you have Ireland's Invasive Species Pathway Action Plan for recreational boaters, which aims to raise awareness about invasive species and the measures that people can take to prevent their spread. Another important pathway of introduction is people releasing invasive species. So you might have heard of people releasing their pet animals into the wild. In the freshwater environment, red-eared slider is a particular concern. People do release fish species or indeed animals for hunting. And some people are releasing, there's no records of this from Ireland, but overseas, some people are releasing non-native species for religious belief. So we're trying to raise awareness about the reasons not to do this. We can't not mention natural dispersal, and we can't not mention rafting associated with floating debris, because this can bring species from very far away to our shores. It also helps species jump locally very quickly. Next, are there any trends with these with the introduction of these species? Any geographic trends? And the data clearly shows, well, it's very hard to pull out trends, but over the last 10 years, the data clearly shows that the east coast of Ireland, obviously where the most economic activity is very, very important, coupled with the south coast of Ireland in previous decade. Now to talk about, oh, I'm sorry, this image is very fuzzy, but now to talk about species ID. Here you see a non-native species which originated from the Pacific Ocean around Japan. It was introduced from mainland Europe into Britain first in Devon, and then slowly came across to Ireland. It's pretty widespread now. This species, there's actually two subspecies which you can only distinguish by microscopic means, but you can distinguish this species from the native species. It's a dark green seaweed. It has the dichotomous branching, which hopefully you can see in the fuzzy image. It's usually less than 50 centimeters long, but it can grow up to 1 meter in length. A key concern with this species is that it can displace native species. You could confuse it with the native Codium tomentosum, and this species is easily distinguished by looking at the holdfast. The native species has a more fleshy holdfast compared to a disc-like holdfast in the non-native variety. Another species of seaweed, the brown seaweed, oyster thief, Culpamenia. This is one of the first species, non-native species that I learned to ID, so I find it relatively straightforward to identify. It originated from the Northwest Pacific. It is one of the most successful brown algal non-native species in the world. Fortunately, it's not associated with any declines in biodiversity, but it is a indicator of environmental change. You can identify it by its thin-walled sphere. Obviously, it's a little bit desiccated here with the tide out. It's greenish and olive brown, and it's usually only about one centimeter, maybe up to 10 centimeters in diameter. You could confuse it with the native species. I'm going to try to pronounce the Latin name, Lethisia marina. But this particular species is very soft and gelatinous when touched. Whereas Culpamenia is dry and papery to the touch and can be torn easily. So once you know those two species, you'll easily be able to distinguish them from each other. Wakame or Undaria pinnatifida is another Korean-Japanese invasive species. This particular species can grow up to 1.5 meters to 3 meters in length. You can see that it is, hopefully you can see from the image that it is a branched holdfast. So you'll be able to see the kind of branching on that. And that helps you identify it as this species. The stipe has wavy edges, and it has a very rigid appearance as well. A broad, flattened leaf-shaped blade is very conspicuous as well. You can find this species from low tide down to about 15 or 20 meters, depending on the water clarity in the area. It can occur in very dense, rigorous stands, which indicates that it could be outcompeting native species. You can see from the map up here that the distribution is very much, the known distribution, should I say, is very much on the east coast of Ireland. So if there are more records around the coast, we would like to identify that. Just to give you a little bit of an indication, this species was first found in Belfast Lough and Carlingford Lough and reported in 2014. So it is a relatively recent introduction to our shores. This infographic tries to give you a little bit of an indication of some of the species that you might confuse it with. So Saccharisa, it can easily be distinguished by the holdfast and looking at the blade itself. But the holdfast is very bulbous, whereas Undaria has a branched holdfast. Seabelt or Saccharina, I don't think is very easily to confuse with Wakame because it looks so different, and I think everyone will be aware of what it looks like from just walking out on the shore. And Alaria is another species that some people have confused for Wakame as well, but there are similarities that it is understandable for that particular species to be confused. Here is just images of the holdfast of Saccharisa versus Wakame. So if you're looking for Saccharisa, you're looking for this bulbous holdfast, which I'm sure you all know from diving. Next is golden kelp, and for me, this is a little bit of a surprising species because of all the places to be introduced. Northwest Mayo would be one that you would say is a low likelihood. It is away from our main ports and it's away from our main marinas. So it is quite surprising that this species turned up here. It was originally recognized, I believe, by NUI Galway and probably Sea Search as well. So it seems to have jumped over 1,000 kilometers from its nearest population in the UK. The genetic analysis that I think was led by NUI Galway and Sea Search does indicate that it may have come from Portugal. So again, another surprising jump for Ireland. It's great to have photographs of what a species looks like underwater. So if you are diving and you are able to take photographs, I can only encourage you because that helps other people identify species. But this is what you might come across. One of the key things to say is that the color is one of the characteristics that you're looking for in this species. Because if you're comparing it to the native species, Laminaria digitata or Laminaria hyperborea, they're both darker. They have a much darker appearance compared to the golden kelp. Another key feature of the native species is they usually have a lot more epiphytes. It's unusual to look at another species to identify a particular species, but for the native species, you are able to look at and go, it has more epiphytes. A species that I'm sure you're all familiar with is wireweed or Sargassum muticum. Again, another species native to Japan and Korea. It has pretty much a very widespread distribution around our coasts right now. You can see what it looks like in rock pools. You can see what it looks like in close up. It's usually about 2 meters long. It's a light brown color. It's attached by a disc-shaped holdfast, and it's very branched, as you can see from the close-up image here. It is leaf-like proliferations that you can see as well, and you can also see the small gas vesicles along the thallus, and it's very slimy to the touch as well. I hope this video works. But again, you can see what it looks like if you were diving through this particular species. So this gives you a good indication of the impact that the species can have. It can also outcompete native seagrass beds as well, and it can very much dominate locally. It can compete rare species of seaweeds too. Another species, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is the Pacific oyster. I'm not going to go too much into the identification of the species because I think you will all probably be very familiar with it. But it's, you can see the elongate oval shell. You can see it's deeply cupped as well, so you can pick that out as well. It's known that the species is used in aquaculture. It's a very important aquaculture species. It has a widespread distribution around Ireland. There are known sites where it's settling in Galway, and I've heard of sites where it's settling in Cork as well. And this is where members of the public could help report settlement of the Pacific oyster so that management efforts could be prioritized and undertaken to prevent it forming larger reefs that you see here in England. You can see that there, in some areas of the North Sea, the intertidal areas become very dominated with this species, but we don't, that I'm aware of, have that in Ireland yet. One thing to note is that it can be confused with the native oyster. But the native oyster has a very different shape. Oval or pear-shaped is a good way of describing it, with a scaly surface. It's also important to say that for the native oyster, the two halves of the shells are different shape as well. So that's a distinguishing feature for that species. Australian tube worm. I don't know if any of you ever dive in your marinas, or pick up buoys that have been left in the marina environment for a long time. But if you have, especially overseas, this particular species is one to look out for. It is an Australian species, obviously, probably native to both Australia and New Zealand. Um, it can form these white calcareous tubes that they turn yellowish brown as the animal ages, up to 8 centimeters in length, and they also have this less than half a centimeter diameter. So they're very small. If you see photographs of them encrusting on ships, you will see the potential risk that this species poses, because they can really encrust huge, vast areas. And they are not noted from too many places around Ireland. So we are at the early stages of invasion for this one. So it's definitely one to look out for. The leathery sea squirt is, or Styloclava, is another one to look out for. Cropping up more and more areas around Ireland. Again, another recent introduction from Japan or Korea, believed to have been introduced to Europe via two ways. First, warships returning from the Korea War to Britain, and then associated with an introduction into the Netherlands. You can, I feel this is an easy-ish species to identify. It can be quite large. It can reach about 12 centimeters in length, with the stalk taking up about a third of that length. You can see the siphons as well, so it is very distinguishable. So you should be able to identify that relatively straightforward. If not, take a photograph and we will be able to help you with that. Next is the carpet sea squirt, and this is a species that I do wonder about the impact, and I'll explain a little bit more as we go on. I remember when this species first turned up in Ireland, in Malahide and Carlingford, and then we found a record in Clew Bay and Galway Bay. This species is very hard to identify. It can only really be confidently identified by looking at it under the microscope and genetic means. But you can take photographs and you can share those with experts, and they will help you and us decide if it is indeed worth exploring more, or if we can conclude that it is invasive, it is didymnum. Because at a small scale, you're not really going to be able to confidently say. But you can see as it goes larger, it's forming these carpets. That becomes a little bit more indicative of this species. It can form these pendulum-like growths, which you might see as divers hanging off artificial substrates, dangling down. But one particular growth pattern that I'm concerned about is what's observed in George's Bank in Maine, USA, where they've found it growing across the seabed, covering gravel habitats, covering important spawning grounds. We have no evidence of this happening in Ireland right now, but if divers are out looking and find evidence of that, it would be great if you could report that back so we could document that evidence. Next species is, again, a species of relatively recent arrival into Ireland, Cropidula fornicata, slipper limpet. One thing to say is this little shelf here on the underside, that helps you identify the species as well. It's about 5 centimeters in length with a large shell. So you can also see that in the wild, you'll see that it grows on top of itself. Basically, you have a number of individuals growing on each other as well. It can smother seabird species. It can alter seabird habitat structure dramatically, changing communities. So if you do see this species and you do see the impact, again, please help us understand the impact of a marine invasive Yeah, it's known to foul a variety of hard-shelled organisms as well. So you might see it even growing on native species, commercial shellfish as well. But again, it's still highly localized. So as far as we're aware, it's only in these areas right now. So please help us build up a picture of this distribution. I don't know if many of you will have heard of the blue crab, and you might be surprised that this species is turning up in Ireland. Um, it's really a species that's more adapted to warmer waters, and it is a bit interesting that it is turning up in the Dublin area. It's probably associated with people who are bringing in live food or even frozen and then discarding them. Um, so we're not 100% sure if there's a population out there right now. There's no real active crabbing in this areas or lobster pot in this areas as well. So we don't have any way of monitoring this species to see if there is a population or if it just if those sightings in Ireland were from discards. If this species does take off in Ireland, it could potentially really alter our marine ecosystems. So that is a big concern. You can identify it by its blue to olive green color, as you can see in the image here. The shells can reach up to 9 inches across, so it's quite a big crab. I mean, it doesn't look like many native species in Ireland, so I think you can confidently identify it if you do see it. Another species, which you're probably not going to see in the marine environment, is the mitten crab, but it has been identified in the Waterford area, in the Waterford estuary. I doubt anybody dives in the Waterford estuary, but this is a species that could change. I mean, it's impossible to confuse this species with native species because there are no native crabs, freshwater crab species in Ireland. Also, the mittens are very diagnostic for this species as well. But if it does spread around Ireland, it will dramatically alter our freshwater ecosystems. It could also impact on hydroelectric power production as well and other extraction in the environment. I can share with you some guides on how to identify crab species. So this is a guide produced by BIM. So you can see that there's 5 non-native crabs. You can see the carapace, the shell, and then you can see some of the unique identification features. So I'll be able to share that with you as well after this presentation. The American lobster is a particular species of concern. Our European lobster is well, it's a famous species that we all love. But there's concern that this species, the American lobster, could come in, outcompete with this, or even introduce disease to our native lobster species. Again, you're noticing that it's in the Dublin area, which may indicate that maybe it's from discards or people maybe even illegally trying to establish. And I do emphasize maybe. There's no evidence of this yet, but maybe trying to establish a fishery because this is an economically valuable species. You can see the identification features of the American lobster versus the European lobster. The redder claw, you can see the difference in the spines of the heads, and you can see the difference in the tails as well. They also have different color compared to the American lobster can be slightly redder, whereas the European lobster can be slightly bluer. I do want to highlight another freshwater species, and that's a species that's not present in Ireland, and this is the killer shrimp. This is one that I would love to keep out of Ireland. It's found in Cardiff Bay. It's found in freshwater and brackish environments. But if it does arrive in Ireland, it could potentially drive ecosystem change and loss of some native species, including salmon or indeed lots of other fish species. But you can see it here associated with waders. So if you are ever diving in a freshwater environment, biosecurity becomes even more important to avoid spreading this species. Biosecurity. So why is it important? Usually, when an invasive species is, particularly in the marine environment, turns up, it is impossible to control. There's a few examples worldwide, one from New Zealand and one from California, where marine invasive species have been controlled successfully, but they are the exception, not the norm. So preventing a species arriving in the first place, it prevents the environmental damage and it prevents the cost associated with management. I also want to say that invasive species can survive long periods in damp or wet conditions. So you will know moving equipment, they can remain wet for a long time. This means that invasive species could potentially survive transit. And even a small amount of sediment can carry them with them, particularly diseases for wildlife. And there's also a legal obligation on us to not spread invasive and non-native species. I want to highlight that there's a huge body of legislation, policy, and research in Ireland. So we have new invasive species legislation in both Ireland and Northern Ireland. We also have the European Union invasive alien species regulation as well. We have global targets to reduce the introduction of invasive species by 50% and minimize their impact. We also have national strategies and research projects. So we've invasive species strategy in Northern Ireland. We have Ireland's fourth biodiversity action plan, and then we have a whole host of other drivers to prevent the spread of invasive species. At the data center, we run the campaign called Check Clean Dry, which is a campaign for water users, recreational water users, to raise awareness of what you can do on a regular basis easily to prevent the spread of non-native species around our coasts and freshwater environments. It is simple. Check your equipment. So you're checking for any small bits of plant material, dirt, grit. Some of the seaweed species can spread from fragments as small as 1 centimeter in length. And then you have the microscopic components associated with some invasive species. There's slight variations in the marine and freshwater requirements. So if you are removing fouling, particularly off your boat, you're asked to put it in bins and not in the water. Whereas, because you may have anti-fouling paint that may be toxic. So it's important to put it in a bin and not back in the environment. Clean your equipment. And this is where a little bit of elbow grease comes in handy. Thoroughly clean your equipment. For marine environment, relying on fresh water is really, really useful at reducing the risk of invasive species. They're marine species for a reason. They're salt tolerant. They like salt water. They don't like fresh water. So using fresh water or tap water is really important. If you can use hot water, that's very important because it reduces the risk of spreading disease as well. And pay attention to any crevices. If any of you operate boats or work in marinas, remove biofouling regularly. By keeping on top of it means that you're avoiding the impact on your boat, but you're also avoiding the impact or the risk of spreading invasive species. Where possible, dry. These are aquatic species. They're adapted to wet environments. If you dry your equipment for about 48 hours, you are probably going to kill anything that may have survived the previous 2 steps. It's a very simple message to check, clean, and dry. And by doing each of those steps, you are going to protect the environment and reduce the rate of spread. Another thing that organizations can do is adopt a biosecurity policy position themselves. So if you are organizing events, you would promote invasive species awareness. You would promote biosecurity. You would audit your own activities to reduce the risk of spreading invasive species. It doesn't need to be war and peace. 3-4 pages long is probably more than enough for most organizations. It can be very simple, but it just needs to be something that's effective, that guides you. I'm going to finish up relatively quickly, but I want to highlight the importance of good data and the importance of citizen scientists. And Dave Wall, who some of you might know, will be able to give you a better introduction to Explore Your Shore at some point in the future. But I'm going to rob some of his slides as well. Before we do, I want to show you the importance of sea search. So the Biomar project, which is a specific project which ran from 1993 to 1996, generated almost 54,000 records all around Ireland. The British Phycological Society, almost over an extensive period, has generated almost 50,000 records. But if you look at the impact of sea search, you've almost generated 60,000 records. That is an incredibly valuable data set, and it's something that's really important. And it's important to raise awareness of invasive species so that we can get more and more records of these species around our coasts. One thing I want to say is data sets allow us to understand the shifting baseline. Excuse me. I didn't know until very recently just how much of an impact irresponsible fisheries have had in Ireland. Here you see critically endangered angel shark. In 1965, 1.5 tons of fish were captured by 12 sea anglers, and all of these were dumped. They weren't eaten. It was all part of a competition. Today, you won't see these species very readily. But without some of these images and without data, we wouldn't understand the impact. We wouldn't understand what we've lost. So that just shows you how important baseline data is. Another species is the sea urchin, which was overfished by the late 1990s. You can see the urchin holes. This is not a protected species, but it's now rare around our coasts because of irresponsible fishing. I'm going to say that data also can be used to indicate climate change. So looking at Portuguese man-of-war, you can see the records in 2016, 2017, and 2018, and then you can see the dramatic jump. So your individual records add up to an important data set. You also can contribute to understanding environmental change, eutrophication. Are seagrass habitats, are they doing well, or are they being overtaken by algal blooms? This image is obviously not from Ireland. I do want to say about, before I finish up, the importance of taking photographs. Photographs will demonstrate the impact of invasive species, but it's also critical for validation of records and supporting identification. If you do have a photograph, it really speeds up this process. And then that means we can validate all records in our database, and we have the best data available to make decisions and understand our environment. This image here shows a perfect example of why photographs are so important. This is the underside of a buoy that was taken in Dublin. You can see a colonial sea squirt, probably Didymnum vexillum. You can see a bryosome. You can see different species all in a very, very small area. The fingers give you a scale for this image. If you want to explore citizen science more, there's resources on our Explore Your Shore website where you can learn more and more about invasive species and marine biodiversity around Ireland. We also have a series of resources that you can get from our shop. And if you want to learn more about these species, or if you're not sure about a particular species, one thing you could do is suggest where ID guides would be useful for you so that we can tailor ID guides for you. I want to highlight the Explore Your Shore and the amount of records that have gone into this database. So from 2019 to 2024, there have been almost 26,000 records collected all around the coast of Ireland. So it's a very important data set. But again, the importance of citizen scientists and bringing focus to this area. You can see that the number of records coming in from citizen scientists was relatively low, but then it jumped up. So the importance of citizen scientists' work, such as Explore Your Shore or Sea Search, cannot be understated. And my last message really, or last call to action, is photograph and report the unusual. We do not know all of the invasive species that will arrive on our shores. You may encounter something that has never been identified here before. If you do, please do photograph it and report it to us. So that will help us understand the risk of invasive species. And thank you very much.